So far, we have explored some basic concepts of ecosystem restoration. What is it? Why we should do it? What should we restore to? And what are some important tools we might use, such as state and transition models, to understand the development and trajectory of development for the disturbed site we want to restore? This week, we'll introduce another important concept for ecosystem restoration: adaptive management. Adaptive management, as we will see, is a process that promotes flexible decision-making and helps guide the restoration process. It can be adjusted in the face of uncertainties as outcomes from management actions, such as specific restoration treatments that we will explore later on this semester, become better understood. Adaptive management can also help us move forward when we may have incomplete knowledge or understanding of the ecosystem we want to restore, a common occurrence in many ecosystem restoration projects. So by the end of this lecture, I hope you will have a better understanding of 5 basic aspects of adaptive management and how these relate to ecosystem restoration. First, you should be able to explain the need for adaptive decision-making approach, and you should be able to define the concept of adaptive management, or AM. Third, you should be able to explain the key steps in adaptive management process and describe how this process improves restoration outcomes. And finally, I would like you to have some understanding of the key legislation relevant to the adaptive management process, primarily when working with federal partners or with federal agencies. So let's start with a little bit of background. Adaptive management, or what's sometimes called adaptive resource management, is a process of structured decision-making, and it's iterative decision-making. And what I mean by iterative decision-making is that information or data that you acquire following an initial decision or action as part of your restoration process or management process will feed subsequent decisions. So this means, in an adaptive management approach, information is going to be continuously collected and integrated into decisions. So this is basically the opposite of applying a restoration treatment and walking away. And where this can be important is that adaptive management really helps facilitate sound decision making, where outcomes are often uncertain, which is often the case in ecosystem restoration. So for example, we may believe that introducing fire back into a grassland to restore certain species is a very beneficial process. But what happens if that initial prescribed burn is followed by another the year after, or another burn the year after that? Without monitoring those treatments and measuring the ecosystem response, we actually may end up causing more harm than good with our restoration treatments. So why do we actually need an approach like adaptive management? Let's think back to our previous discussion of Tony Bradshaw and how restoration is really like our acid test of our understanding of an ecosystem, how it is put together, and how it works. One of the primary reasons we need something like AM is that we will never really understand everything about the ecosystems we wish to restore and manage. Ecology is essentially an incomplete science. A second reason is that restoration often poses new and novel challenges. This means you may often run into new situations and challenges at a particular site that require a new approach. This is why restoration is not an easy thing to do, and we often don't have a cookbook or field manual that outlines a specific treatment that can always be applied to a specific condition on the ground. Finally, as a restoration professional or resource manager, you are going to need to also embrace uncertainty. You will never have all the information you need to make the decision that you need to. And an AM approach provides you with a system so that you can be more comfortable about not always knowing the consequences of how a restoration treatment or management action is going to influence the ecosystem. Let's look at an example from a colleague of mine looking at the effects of restoration treatments of an area formerly grazed by sheep in the Highlands of Scotland. Here, the group conducting the restoration project fenced off an entire landscape to remove sheep and prevent overgrazing, with the belief that without grazing, plant diversity, in this case species richness, will increase and they will have greater success in recruiting the woody species that they want to promote. What was found, and as you can see in this figure, is that this was just not the case. If you look at this graph that plots elevation by species richness or the number of species, for grazed plots in dark colors and ungrazed in light colors, we see that at low elevations it is actually the grazed plots that have the higher species richness. And we see there is an interesting influence of elevation on richness across this gradient and across these sites. For the plots that are grazed or in dark color, it is pretty clear that richness declines with elevation. While for the ungrazed plots, there is a humpback relationship with the highest plant richness at the middle elevations. Ungrazed plots at low elevations have low numbers of species, as do the ungrazed plots at higher elevations. So we can conclude from this that the outcomes of this restoration project don't always meet the expectations, and a single treatment applied across the site may not always work. We can conclude that there is uncertainty associated with the ecosystem response, one that we would not have known if we hadn't monitored the effects of the initial restoration treatment of excluding sheep from these areas we wanted to restore. So as I mentioned earlier, adaptive management is an iterative process where we try to make decisions based on newly acquired information or where information may be lacking about our ecosystem or site we are attempting to restore. And so I think we need to first really specify that AM or adaptive management is not trial and error. We do not randomly go out and apply some treatment and hope that it works. And if it doesn't, we move on to the next option, and then the next option, and then the next option, really just trying to grab bag and finding that sweet spot where we find that treatment that will actually do what we want it to do. What adaptive management really emphasizes is that we openly acknowledge that there are things we don't know about the site, and there's a lot of uncertainty about it. It also acknowledges that there may be other information from sources that we can apply to the site that we intend to restore. And so that our initial plan is not some shot in the dark. It really is based on some understanding and not some random approach. Another thing that adaptive management really emphasizes is that we really learn by doing. We are going to observe what happens when we apply a treatment and then adjust any future treatments based on this new knowledge. And this idea really helps guide us and to take future actions that improve management and improve our restoration treatments. So if we take an adaptive management approach, we don't keep doing something over and over again and hope that it works the next time. We're going to integrate that new knowledge with past knowledge that we've acquired to develop better approaches to restoration and management. So for example, if we go back to the example of fencing out sheep that we saw from the previous experiment in Scotland, any future actions should take into account the effect of elevation on plant richness. We need a new approach in this case, based on this information, that can help us achieve the restoration goals. Finally, adaptive management really helps ensure that we have the participation of stakeholders, as it forces us to seek out additional knowledge that others might have, such as traditional ecological knowledge, or TEK as it's sometimes seen or referred to. But it also really helps us encourage participation of stakeholders in that we're likely to have success with our restoration projects without the help of important community members. And by actively seeking out those members and integrating them into the restoration process through this adaptive management approach, we are much more likely to have success. If we take a closer look at the adaptive management process, we will find there are 10 key elements. These include engaging the relevant stakeholders. So as I just mentioned, you need to get these individuals on board and harness their experience and their knowledge of the area you're working in or the specific site, making sure that they're engaged and you can pull the information and work with them. Second thing that is a key element of adaptive management is that you need to clearly identify the problem to be addressed. There really needs to be a specific issue, a specific problem. In our case, it's going to be we're going to restore some specific structural or functional component of an ecosystem, and we need to clearly identify that early on in the process. A third thing that's critical with adaptive management is that we need to clearly specify the objectives of the restoration project and clearly identify possible trade-offs early on. So we may have a variety of different techniques, whether that includes using prescribed fire or whether we're going to use some sort of silvicultural treatment to restore the structure of a conifer-dominated, a ponderosa pine forest, for example. We need to understand the trade-offs of each of those specific treatments and how that relates back to that specific objective or specific objectives related to that ecosystem of interest. We then need to identify the range of decision alternatives that may be part of a restoration plan. We need to bring those forward, identify what those are, and then look to see what the potential response would be based on some existing body of knowledge. And then it's very important that we specify the assumptions related to our sites and actions. And again, incorporating the knowledge that we might be able to apply from other projects or sites, or from step one, or that first element here where we've engaged our relevant stakeholders and addressed and incorporated their information and incorporated those assumptions into the site and actions we intend to use as part of our restoration plan. 6, we need to try and project and map out the possible consequences of our alternative actions. So here, these are things that then, as part of the adaptive management process, we will then try to test and see whether these alternative actions are going to have a different outcome than our intended management plan. We need to identify the key uncertainties and understand the known unknowns, as it were. What is it that we may know? What is it that we don't know? And what are we sure that we don't know? And what are the uncertainties associated with any of our restoration actions? And then I think another important aspect and an element of the adaptive management process is that we need to think about our tolerance for risk and our ability to cope with some of the unexpected outcomes, such as a regeneration failure. What does it mean if we experience a regeneration failure if we're replanting or trying to regenerate a certain species on a site? Or what happens if we integrate or use some specific restoration tool such as prescribed fire? What kind of risk do we have, and how are we going to measure that risk tolerance for using that specific treatment? These are all things we need to really take into account, and adaptive management allows us to really focus in on. 9th, we need to take into account future impacts and think back to our discussion last week where we discussed resiliency and thinking about state transition models. We need to understand resilience and how we think our restored ecosystem and how resilient it's going to be to things such as land use change or climate change. So we need to think about, as we move forward with the restoration project, how any future impacts may affect our restoration plan to move that stand or that site back across some developmental trajectory. And adaptive management will help us account for some of those future impacts. And then finally, we need to account for legal constraints that may arise as part of a restoration process, and adaptive management takes that into consideration, and an adaptive management approach will help us account for some of these legal constraints. So let's look a little more in depth at the adaptive management process. And so as we've encountered here and just looked at some of the elements of adaptive management, and we think about kind of designing and implementing and monitoring a restoration plan, there's going to be a lot of things we need to think about before we do anything on a site related to restoration. We need to really think hard about some of the options, some of the alternative treatments or alternative approaches that we might use, the impacts and outcomes of those specific treatments and restoration treatments that we may be implementing on a site. And then we need to do so in a way that's really going to be defensible and is really based upon the best available science. Right? So let's take a look at this adaptive management process in a little more in depth. And so this is really not a one-off process, as I've mentioned before. It's a cycle that you're going to continue to do over and over again as time moves forward and you develop and acquire more information about the ecosystem that you're trying to manage or you're trying to restore over time. And so while you may see a variety of diagrams that outline an adaptive management process, I've always found this is one that I really like. And so let's take a little closer look. So I think it's important to first start by focusing in on where do we begin, kind of identifying, first defining that problem, making sure that the community is engaged. And so that might be understanding if we're working here in northern Idaho on a riparian project, we might want to understand what is it specifically and identify the problem of that riparian area or that riparian forest. What is it about it? Is it dominated by invasive species? Is it dominated by some other species that is not our target species? Are there certain structural components we really need to that we don't want to see there? We really need to drill down, understand that, and get our community engaged as we define those management objectives, right? And so once we've identified that problem, we need then to establish some pretty specific goals, right? And these need to be as specific as possible. So we wouldn't want to have a management objective or a goal here that we would be starting out with that we want to restore a prairie, right? That's not specific enough. What we really want to think about is then how would we restore the specific abundance of a dominant species characteristic of a intact prairie ecosystem, such as little blue stem, or is there a lack of invasive species such as cheatgrass? So it's important that we really focus on those key desired outcomes and how they relate back to those specific management objectives. And we really want to make sure that we focus on socioeconomic goals and objectives as well as not just those that are economic, but not just those ecological objectives. Right? So then as part of this planning process, we're going to want to identify performance indicators. And this is really as part of that planning process by having key performance indicators that are measurable, right? Things such as what is the amount of cheatgrass that's left in this rangeland that we're trying to restore. That ties back to that specific management objective of having an intact rangeland ecosystem that has certain levels of species richness, right? That's going to then allow us to help develop a management strategy in action. Those specific treatments that then we're going to think about are going to be effective to reach those objectives that then we can implement out there into our site that's disturbed that we want to restore. And so once we kind of have that planning in place, we're going to then move to what's often kind of the category where what are we going to do and that specific action on the ground, right? So Now we're going to actually take those management strategies, actions, those restoration treatments, and we're going to apply them out onto a disturbed site. And we're going to implement those strategies and actions that are going to help us achieve those objectives. And as part of this, once we actually implement that, so once we actually go out and say, apply a herbicide to eliminate cheatgrass, which is part of our specific management objective for this disturbed rangeland, then we're going to establish some sort of monitoring program and for those specific performance indicators that's going to allow us to measure how effective we've actually been in meeting those stated objectives. Right? And so after we do that, we actually implement our restoration treatment, and then we are going to go out and we're going to evaluate and learn that third major part of the adaptive management process. So we're going to use that monitoring program that we implemented as part of the implementation process of our restoration plan, and we're going to evaluate how successful we are. What is it that we learned? Did we learn that this certain type of herbicide was not effective for eliminating cheatgrass? All right. And then we're going to report what we learned and tie that back and review the overall management program and see if we've met those management objectives. More often than not, we're going to find that we did not meet those management objectives. There was something that happened. There was some environmental interaction that we didn't realize. Maybe there's soil moisture or some type of other species that's interacting with cheatgrass that prevented the herbicide as being effective, right? Or maybe there was something in terms of when we applied that herbicide, and we found that it didn't really have the intended impact that we expected as part of that restoration treatment. At this point in time, we're going to take what we've evaluated and what we've learned from our past planning and our past application, and then we're going to adjust our management actions, right? We're going to go back to the planning. We're going to go back to our specific restoration treatments or our specific hypotheses that we developed as part of this planning and implementation process. And we may adjust that, and we may start over, and we may do this over and over again. And what you'll see and what you'll find as you look at this is that this is going to be something that goes over and over again, right? We're going to continually come back to this process, and we're going to think about what have we done, how successful has it been, what do we need to do differently to really achieve our process. And really, this is going to depend a lot on the specific site as well. There may be instances where we can pretty much plan, implement, evaluate, and sort of walk away and let nature do its thing, where we really focus on enhancing those natural processes, which is always a great idea in terms of restoration. But we may be able to just kind of walk away, and there are examples of this. Northern hardwood forest ecosystems of the lake states or the northeastern United States, we may be able to put those forest stands that haven't been disturbed too greatly back into some sort of process like this, and then we may let nature take over. There may be others where we have to continually come back and come back and come back and adjust what we're doing to really maintain and to see the kind of outcome that we really want to accomplish as part of our restoration plan. So hopefully you can see why this adaptive management process really does seem to integrate really well with what we might think of as being a way to effectively implement restoration on the ground. And so there are some important conditions that are required to apply adaptive management on the ground, right? And there are conditions where it's really appropriate, and other instances where it's not going to be as appropriate. And so let's look at some of these conditions where adaptive management will be effective, right? And so first, there really must be a real management decision to be made, such as what type of restoration treatment are we going to apply to a disturbed site, right? And there really also must be space and willingness to apply what we've learned and experiment with different treatments, and then have the ability to apply that knowledge to future treatments. We also must have measurable objectives, the third point here. So it's really critical that we have something to measure and then are able to compare outcomes after the fact. So for example, the adaptive management approach being applied across the Great Lakes region to combat the invasive species Phragmites and restore wetlands really focuses on directly measuring and comparing how different treatments reduce invasive species. Fourth, because monitoring is expensive, we really should ensure that what we are measuring is of high value. And finally, we should be able to somehow express our uncertainty about the site or ecosystem into some type of testable hypothesis, much like they are doing across the Great Lakes, where they have specific hypotheses about what kind of treatment will be best at eradicating Phragmites. So in this case, it really is getting in there and looking at what do we think is going to be the most effective at removing this invasive species. Is it going to be a herbicide treatment? Is it going to be fire? Is it going to be actively using agricultural practices and something that's much more heavy-handed in these wetlands, right? So we really need to have some sort of monitoring plan that can be implemented for an adaptive management approach to be effective. And so as we've previously mentioned multiple times, this is something that's often neglected in many restoration projects for a variety of reasons, whether it's just overlooked by the folks that are putting the restoration plan on the ground, or that there just isn't enough funding available to do monitoring very well. However, to apply adaptive management to restoration, we really do need to focus on these 5 or 6 important aspects of adaptive management. There are limitations to adaptive management, and it's important to point out that this is not always going to be our best or only approach. And it's certainly not appropriate where the decision-making process can only occur once. And there are examples where this might happen. So consider a situation where you might be only allowed to go and treat an area or a site once, right? Or the treatment is so intensive or wide-reaching that the consequences are going to be pretty extreme, right? So there may be instances where, an adaptive management where we can't actually go in there and experiment with different types of activities and different types of treatments is not going to be allowable. And from that instance, there may not be a real reason to focus on implementing an adaptive management approach as part of our restoration plan. There's really also no point in taking an adaptive management approach when there are going to be really strong conflicts over management priorities or specific actions that can't be resolved, right? So a good example of this might be in areas where parks or resource agencies are employing sharpshooters to call deer that are overgrazing forests or grasslands as part of a restoration treatment, right? And so there are numerous cases where conflict among different groups have stopped these types of restoration treatments from moving forward, right? Especially where they may be the most economically feasible option, right? Another one that you can see here is the the ability to use timber harvesting as part of a restoration plan where there just might be significant community conflicts or opinions about whether harvesting is an appropriate technique to use. And so these may be things where you might have to deal with and you can't resolve those conflicts over those management priorities or the specific actions that are going to need to be taken in a way that is going to keep you from applying an adaptive management approach. And then finally, AM is really not an effective approach where the risks are going to be too high, right? And we may be moving into that territory with trying to introduce prescribed burning into many parts of the western U.S. especially around um, urban areas or urban centers where we've seen more and more, especially here recently in California, with a variety of wildland fire that's destroyed both lives and property. Right? So, it's really critical that you have the space in an adaptive management approach to experiment and adjust as conditions change. And there may be just an environment just based on the land use or the community where it is, or just that the community does not agree with the most economically feasible treatments that you can apply as a restoration treatment. So as I mentioned at the start, there are also there's also a legislative part to or element to adaptive management that's really going to be important for you to understand and be aware of, that prevents a possible constraint on implementing an adaptive management approach in a restoration project. And the first and primary one that you should be aware of is the role of the National Environmental Policy Act, or NEPA. Right? This is primarily in the form of being aware that you may be required to file a notice of intent to prepare environmental impact statements, or an EIS, draft EIS, or final EIS, or some record of decision again and again and again, over and over, when your monitoring activities develop new information that are part of this adaptive management approach, where you'll be required by an agency to prepare a supplemental EIS in response to this change in the environment. So you can see where this might really become a bureaucratic nightmare, or at least require you to spend considerable amount of time working through some of the necessary legislative requirements and some of the policy aspects of a restoration process if you're going to use this adaptive management approach. Because again, what are we really focused on in terms of adaptive management and restoration? It's that you actively plan based on knowledge, you apply the treatment, and then you monitor and you measure the outcomes of those treatments. And you adapt to that new knowledge and you incorporate that new knowledge moving forward. And so the requirement for a supplemental EIS or an environmental impact statement under NEPA is going to be triggered when the responsible agency makes changes to a proposed action that's relevant to environmental concerns. And so, as I mentioned, we know that throughout the adaptive management process, we are going to develop that new information and we're going to adapt our approach that will undoubtedly result in new conditions on the ground and changes to the environment. So this is going to, as I mentioned, create a potential bureaucratic process that's going to require you to spend a lot of attention and pay attention to that process. So these types of EIS filings are going to be required for any major federal actions significantly affecting the quality of the human environment. So you should be aware that if you're working for a federal agency implementing a restoration plan, or you have federal partners that may be part of a collaborative group that's working on a restoration plan, such as the BLM or the U.S. Forest Service or the Fish and Wildlife Service, you're going to need to be aware of these important policies and how they're going to affect you moving forward. There's also other relevant legislation that can impact the adaptive management process. And two of these are the Endangered Species Act and the Federal Advisory Committee Act. And so in terms of the Endangered Species Act, this means that any action as part of your adaptive restoration process or your restoration plan where you're implementing an adaptive management approach that impacts a threatened or endangered species or their critical habitat, will need to take that into account. And as a general rule, these plans are going to be much more successful when you have the federal agencies that are responsible for these species involved in the process early and often. Okay, and so this is especially true when you consider the risk that might be associated with implementing an adaptive management as a framework to achieve your larger restoration goals and objectives where you have endangered or threatened species. Things like Kirtland's warbler here in the middle a neotropical migrant that utilizes jack pine forests in northern lower Michigan that are fire dependent systems, but is a species that utilizes a very narrow habitat affiliated with early successional jack pine stands. Another one here in the western U.S. is that's seen a lot of attention recently is with sage grouse and greater sage grouse, and how do your restoration actions that you may be working in a rangeland impact this threatened and endangered species. Okay, so these are all things that you'll want to be making sure that you're working with your federal partners and that you're not running afoul of any of this other relevant legislation. Another one that you should be familiar with and understand the potential implications of is the Federal Advisory Committee Act, or FACA, which requires that certain actions have advisory committees established to provide advice and guidance for federal managers and officials. Again, so if you have partners or you're working for a federal agency or you're working in some sort of collaborative group across a broader landscape where you have a diverse set of partners and stakeholders, you may be required to have a charter and a public notice of meetings, which again will add to the bureaucratic load of your restoration project. And you don't want to run afoul of these specific legislative actions that are going to be important. The flip side of this is that if you are engaged with your stakeholders early and often, which is part of that adaptive management process, you can help to ensure that you're not going to miss some important legislative policy that is going either at the federal, state, or local level if you're engaged with these stakeholders early in your process, early planning process of your restoration project, and you have them engaged throughout the entire cycle, both in the planning as well as the active implementation on the ground, the monitoring, and then how you plan to evaluate and adjust your restoration plan moving forward. So in summary, there's a variety of benefits and challenges for using adaptive management for restoration. There's 4 major positive aspects of using this AM framework. And these include, the flexibility and face of uncertainty that we'll always face in the restoration world. AM is also going to promote optimal decision making, and it's going to encourage you to focus on long-term collaboration with a variety of stakeholders, and that's going to really force you to consider trade-offs as you work and you discuss different options and how you plan to adjust to what you learn as part of the restoration process, right? And then finally, and I think this is an important one, is this is going to help us really avoid a cookbook approach to restoration. That idea that you can just grab a bunch of seed if you're trying to restore a prairie, grab a seed drill, go out, put the seed on the ground, walk away, all right? This really requires you to monitor how well the restoration's working and to adjust your approach as necessary, right? And so I think there's countless examples, at least in my experience, of these kind of cookbook approaches to restoration where it's kind of a one and done. We're going to do it, walk away, and these often result in failures and a loss of funds and a loss of money and people's time that are involved in these kinds of approaches, right? But the adaptive management approach is not perfect, right? And you should be aware that there are things and challenges with adaptive management that you need to be aware of, right? One of those is that you must have objectives that are ecologically justifiable, right? And you may run into situations where there's a reluctance to change specific management practices, right? Or use. There may be instances where, thinning and prescribed fire as a restoration tool in many communities is seen as being very negative, right? But those might be management practices that really need to be implemented um, as part of your restoration plan. And you may have reluctance among your stakeholders to actually allow you to use those, right? And so if you don't have that ability to have give and take and to adjust and to experiment with different um, restoration plans, this approach isn't going to be as effective as it would be if you had the ability, right? And if you don't have that ability and you don't have a long-term commitment to evaluate the long-term implications of specific treatments and have that space then based on your evaluation to then turn around and develop new techniques and adjust your approach, this may not be a great approach for you to use because it may just take too much time and be too expensive, and you're going to lose that real benefit of promoting kind of this optimal decision making and that flexibility in the face of uncertainty, right? So you need to be thinking long and hard, and that's really where it gets started at the planning process to think about what can you do at this site, what are your potential options in terms of restoration, who are your stakeholders, and all of that needs to happen early in the planning process. And at that point in time, you can decide whether you want to use an adaptive management approach or whether the conditions on the ground really are not going to allow you to move in that direction. So to wrap up, you should remember that adaptive management provides a structure for considering difficult restoration challenges. It's going to help us embrace uncertainty in dynamic situations, which are going to be the norm in your career as a restoration practitioner or a resource manager, not the exception. It's going to require and that we value background research, that we have some information, and that we're integrating what we know about the system into our initial planning, right? As we develop and implement and design our restoration plan. But it also then treats restoration as a learning experience where we have stakeholder engagement and participatory action is going to be emphasized as we move forward. So as we go forward and we look more at options about how to design restoration plans, and then we look more specifically at treatments, I want you to keep in mind that this adaptive management approach can be something that we can use and implement to help ensure that our restoration plans are going to be successful.